The dusty streets of Willow Creek, Arizona stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of 1887, where secrets buried deeper than gold mines would soon surface through the eyes of a child who saw what adults refused to acknowledge. Martha Caldwell had made it her ritual, every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, to position herself on the weathered wooden porch of her modest home, her weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee that had long grown cold. The townspeople whispered behind lace curtains about the widow who waited for nothing, or perhaps everything, while the desert wind carried their gossip across the settlement like tumbleweeds. What they didn't understand was that Martha wasn't waiting for someone to arrive. She was waiting for someone to remember she existed. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a town where everyone knew everyone's business, she had become invisible, a ghost among the living, until the day a mysterious cowboy rode into town with secrets darker than the approaching storm clouds. Jake Morrison had the kind of presence that made conversations halt mid-sentence and forced even the boldest men to lower their eyes when he passed. His weathered face told stories of 1,000 sunsets on the range, but his eyes held shadows that spoke of things no decent man should have witnessed. He'd arrived in Willow Creek 3 months prior, claiming to be a drifter looking for honest work. But honest work rarely required a man to carry 2 guns and sleep with one eye open. The truth was that Jake Morrison was running from something far worse than the law, something that had followed him across 3 states and would eventually catch up to him in ways he never anticipated. His 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had adapted to their nomadic lifestyle with the resilience children possess when they have no choice but to accept their circumstances as normal. She'd learned not to ask about her mother, not to question why they never stayed anywhere long enough to make friends, and not to wonder why her father's hands shook sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. The first time Emma noticed the woman on the porch, she'd been playing with a corn husk doll behind the general store, her imagination transforming the dusty alley into a grand ballroom where ladies wore beautiful dresses instead of faded calico. Martha had been sitting there as usual, her eyes scanning the horizon for something that would never come, when the child's laughter drifted across the evening air like a melody she'd forgotten existed. Something about the sound made Martha's heart constrict with a pain so sharp it nearly took her breath away, reminding her of dreams she'd buried alongside her husband 5 years earlier. Emma, with the fearless curiosity of childhood, had wandered closer to the porch that evening, drawn by the woman who seemed as lonely as the stars that were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Their first conversation had been simple, innocent, revolving around Emma's doll and Martha's offer of fresh-baked cookies. But it had planted seeds that would grow into something neither of them expected as weeks passed. Emma's visits to Martha's porch became as regular as the sunset, much to Jake's initial concern and growing bewilderment. He'd watch from a distance as his daughter, who had learned to be suspicious of strangers out of necessity, chatted animatedly with the widow about everything from cloud shapes to the stories Martha would tell about the old days when Willow Creek was nothing more than a way station for travelers. Jake found himself studying Martha Caldwell with the same intensity he'd once reserved for tracking dangerous men across hostile terrain. She moved with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to find strength in solitude, her voice carrying the kind of gentleness his daughter had never known from a woman's lips. There was something about Martha that made Jake's carefully constructed walls begin to crack, allowing glimpses of the man he'd been before circumstances forced him to become someone else entirely. The transformation in Jake Morrison became apparent to everyone in Willow Creek, though none could explain what had caused the mysterious cowboy to begin smiling again. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house where Jake and Emma rented a room, noticed he'd started whistling while he shaved in the mornings, a sound she'd never heard from the usually grim man. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith who'd hired Jake for odd jobs, observed that the cowboy's work had taken on a different quality, as if he'd found reasons to take pride in what he was doing instead of merely going through the motions of survival. Even Doc Patterson, who'd treated Emma for a fever the previous month, remarked to his wife that Jake Morrison seemed like a different man, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what had changed. The answer, as Emma would soon make abundantly clear to anyone willing to listen, was simpler than the adults imagined and more profound than they could have guessed. It was on a particularly warm evening in late September when Emma made the observation that would change everything for 3 lonely souls in Willow Creek. She'd been sitting on Martha's porch as had become her custom, watching her father approach from the direction of the livery stable where he'd been working late, when she noticed something that had escaped her attention before. "Miss Martha," Emma said in the matter-of-fact way children have of stating profound truths. "Have you noticed that Papa only smiles when he can see your porch from wherever he is?" Martha's coffee cup nearly slipped from her fingers as she followed Emma's gaze to where Jake was indeed smiling. His eyes fixed on the porch where his daughter sat beside the woman who'd somehow become the center of both their worlds. The realization hit Martha like a physical blow, not because she was surprised by Jake's feelings, but because she finally understood that her own heart had been awakened from its 5-year slumber by a man who carried secrets as heavy as her own grief. The mystery that had surrounded Jake Morrison since his arrival in Willow Creek began to unravel that same evening when Martha noticed the way his hand instinctively moved to his gun when a rider approached from the east. She'd seen that look before, in her late husband's eyes when he'd spoken of the war and the things he'd done that he could never undo. Jake's past was written in the scars on his hands, the way he positioned himself so he could see all entrances to any room he entered, and the nightmares that Emma had mentioned in passing, thinking all fathers cried out in their sleep. Martha realized she was falling in love with a man who might disappear at any moment, taking with him the child who'd brought laughter back into her empty house, and the hope she'd thought was buried forever alongside her husband in the town cemetery. The truth about Jake Morrison came to light in the most unexpected way, through a letter that arrived at the Willow Creek post office addressed to a name no one in town recognized. Jeremiah Thornton had been a different man in a different life. A deputy marshal who'd made the mistake of witnessing something he shouldn't have seen and knowing something he should never have learned. The letter, forwarded through 3 different post offices over the span of 6 months, contained information that Jake had both hoped for and dreaded, confirmation that the men who'd forced him to fake his death and abandon his identity had finally been brought to justice. The relief should have been overwhelming, but instead Jake found himself terrified by the possibility that he could finally stop running, because stopping meant risking the kind of happiness he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 3 years running from his past only to find his future in the last place he'd expected to find it, on a dusty porch in Arizona territory where a lonely woman waited each evening for reasons she'd never fully understood herself. Martha's own secret was far simpler but no less profound than Jake's elaborate deception about his identity. She'd been waiting on that porch every evening not for someone to return, as the townspeople assumed, but for the courage to stop waiting for her life to begin again. Her husband's death had left her not just alone but convinced that love was something that happened once in a lifetime, if a person was lucky enough to experience it at all. Watching Jake with Emma, seeing the tenderness beneath his rough exterior, and the way his face softened when his daughter laughed, had awakened feelings Martha thought had died with her husband. She'd been waiting on that porch for permission to live again, and somehow Emma Morrison had become the child who'd given her that permission simply by choosing to share her secrets and dreams with a woman the rest of the world had forgotten. The confrontation that would test everything Jake, Martha, and Emma had built together came on a cold October morning when 3 riders arrived in Willow Creek asking questions about a man matching Jake's description. Sheriff Coleman, who'd grown suspicious of Jake's explanations about his past, had begun to wonder if his instincts about the mysterious cowboy were more accurate than he'd wanted to believe. The riders claimed to be bounty hunters, but Jake recognized them immediately as the men he'd been running from, the corrupt officials who'd forced him to disappear after he'd witnessed them murdering a federal judge who'd been investigating their activities. The moment Jake saw them talking to Sheriff Coleman outside the jail, he knew his time in Willow Creek had come to an end, but he also knew he couldn't leave without ensuring Martha and Emma would be safe from the consequences of his presence in their lives. The decision Jake made that morning would have ramifications none of them could have anticipated, setting in motion events that would force all 3 to confront the difference between running from the past and choosing to fight for the future. Instead of simply disappearing as he'd done so many times before, Jake made the choice to trust Martha Caldwell with the truth about who he was and why he'd come to Willow Creek. The conversation that took place on Martha's porch that evening, with Emma playing nearby and unaware that her world was about to change forever, was perhaps the most honest exchange Jake had ever had with another human being. Martha listened without judgment as Jake explained about his life as Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Thornton, about the corruption he'd uncovered, about the staged death that had allowed him to escape with Emma, and about the 3 years of running that had led them to her porch and her heart. Martha's response surprised Jake more than anything that had happened to him since he'd been forced to become someone else entirely. Instead of fear or recrimination, She felt a fierce protectiveness toward this man who'd sacrificed everything to keep his daughter safe, and who'd somehow managed to maintain his fundamental decency despite circumstances that would have destroyed weaker men. Her own strength, dormant for 5 years of widowhood and grief, surfaced with a power that surprised them both as she made it clear that if Jake was willing to stop running, she was willing to stand beside him and face whatever came next. The plan they devised that night was simple in its boldness and revolutionary in its implications for 3 people who'd all been shaped by loss and the fear of loving again. The trap they set for the corrupt officials masquerading as bounty hunters required Jake to use skills he'd hoped never to need again. But this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. Martha had connections in Willow Creek that Jake lacked, relationships built over years of quiet service to her community, and she used every one of them to ensure that when the confrontation came, it would be on their terms rather than his enemies. Sheriff Coleman, once Martha explained the real situation, proved to be exactly the kind of lawman Jake had tried to be before corruption had forced him into hiding. Doc Patterson, Mrs. Henderson, Tom Bradley, and even the banker, Mr. Williams, all rallied to support a plan that would either free Jake Morrison from his past forever or destroy any chance the 3 of them had for a future together. The showdown, when it came, was swift and decisive, but not in the way anyone expected. The corrupt officials, confident they were dealing with a broken man on the run, walked directly into a carefully orchestrated trap that exposed their true identities and their crimes to witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought. Jake's testimony, combined with evidence he'd hidden before faking his death 3 years earlier, was enough to ensure that the men who'd forced him to abandon his life would spend their remaining years behind bars. The revelation that Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Thornton was alive and willing to testify against his former colleagues sent shockwaves through the territorial government. But it also meant that Jake Morrison could finally reclaim his real name and the life he'd thought was lost forever. Emma Morrison Thornton's world changed overnight when she learned that her father's real name was Jeremiah, and that they could finally stop moving from town to town like leaves blown by the wind. But the biggest change in her young life came when Martha Caldwell became not just the woman who baked cookies and told stories on the porch, but the mother she'd never had and always dreamed of finding. The wedding, held in the small church at the center of Willow Creek, was attended by the entire town. People who'd watched 3 lonely souls find each other against odds that should have made their happiness impossible. Sheriff Coleman served as Jake's best man, a gesture of respect and friendship that meant more to the former deputy marshal than any medal or commendation he'd ever received. The house that had once echoed with Martha's solitary footsteps filled with the sounds of family, with Emma's laughter mixing with adult conversation and the comfortable silences that come when people know they belong together. Jake discovered that he had a gift for carpentry, channeling the steady hands that had once worn a badge into creating beautiful furniture for their home and taking commissions from neighbors who appreciated fine craftsmanship. Martha found that her skills as a seamstress, honed during 5 years of making do with what she had, were in high demand among the women of Willow Creek who wanted dresses that fit properly and lasted through years of hard use. Emma thrived in the stability she'd never known, excelling in her studies and making friends among the local children who accepted her as easily as if she'd been born in Willow Creek. The letters that arrived from the territorial capital over the following months brought news that vindicated Jake's decision to trust Martha and the community that had embraced them. The investigation sparked by his testimony had uncovered corruption reaching into the highest levels of territorial government, leading to reforms that would make Arizona Territory a safer place for honest lawmen and citizens alike. Jake received an official pardon for any crimes committed while operating under false identity, along with an offer to return to law enforcement that he politely declined in favor of the life he'd built with his hands and his heart in Willow Creek. The irony that a man who'd been forced to become someone else had found his true self in the process wasn't lost on any of them, least of all Emma, who understood better than most adults that sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what really matters. The seasons that followed brought the normal rhythms of small-town life, punctuated by moments of joy that reminded all 3 of them how close they'd come to missing this happiness entirely. Emma's first school play, in which she portrayed a pioneer woman with such conviction that the audience forgot they were watching a 9-year-old girl, brought tears to Martha's eyes and a pride to Jake's face that everyone in the audience could see. Martha's first quilt, created for Emma's bed and featuring a pattern of stars that seemed to dance across the deep blue fabric, became a symbol of the permanence they'd all craved without knowing how to ask for it. Jake's workshop, where he crafted rocking chairs and dining tables with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to tracking criminals, became a gathering place for men who appreciated honest work and straight talk. The mystery that had surrounded Jake Morrison's arrival in Willow Creek became part of the town's folklore. A story told with pride about how their community had rallied around a family in need and been rewarded with neighbors who gave more than they took. Children who were too young to remember the original events grew up hearing about the cowboy, who'd been someone else entirely, and the widow who'd found love by waiting on her porch for something she couldn't name. The romance between Martha and Jake became a standard by which other couples in Willow Creek measured their own relationships. Proof that real love could survive secrets, danger, and the kind of pain that changes people forever. Emma's observation about her father's smile had been more than childish insight. It had been the key that unlocked the happiness all three of them had been seeking in different ways. Jake learned that smiling came naturally when he had reasons to be happy. When he could see Emma playing safely in the yard and Martha working in her garden. When he could come home each evening to a house filled with warmth and laughter instead of silence and uncertainty. Martha discovered that waiting on the porch had prepared her not for someone to return from the past, but for someone to arrive and make the future possible. Emma grew up understanding that families could be created as well as born, that love was strong enough to overcome fear, and that sometimes the best things in life came to those who were brave enough to stop running and start believing in tomorrow. The dusty streets of Willow Creek, Arizona still stretch under the desert sun, but they lead somewhere now for the family that found each other against impossible odds. Martha no longer waits alone on her porch each evening. Instead, she sits beside her husband while their daughter plays nearby. All three of them aware that they'd nearly missed this happiness entirely. The townspeople still whisper behind lace curtains, but now they whisper about how right the three of them look together. How Emma has her mother's gentleness and her father's strength. How Jake's laughter sounds like music when it mixes with Martha's softer chuckles. The desert wind still carries stories across the settlement, but these are stories of second chances and the courage to trust love even when it seems impossible. Stories that remind everyone who hears them that sometimes the best endings come from the most unexpected beginnings. The years that followed brought changes to Willow Creek that none of them could have anticipated when they first found each other on that weathered porch. Emma grew into a young woman of remarkable strength and intelligence, her childhood experiences having taught her to value stability and honesty above all else. At 17, she possessed her father's keen eye for reading people and her mother's gentle way of helping others feel at home in the world. The teachers at the territorial school had long since run out of lessons that could challenge her, and letters had begun arriving from universities back east, offering scholarships to the brilliant daughter of Jeremiah and Martha Thornton. But Emma had no interest in leaving Willow Creek, not when she'd finally found the home she'd spent her early childhood believing didn't exist. Jake's reputation as both craftsman and citizen had spread far beyond the boundaries of their small town, bringing customers from as far away as Phoenix and Tucson who were willing to travel days for furniture built by the man who'd once been Deputy Marshal Jeremiah Thornton. His workshop had expanded twice, and he'd taken on apprentices, young men who learned not just woodworking but the values of honest labor and treating customers fairly. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he'd found more satisfaction in building things than he'd ever experienced in chasing criminals. Though he still occasionally consulted with territorial authorities when particularly difficult cases required someone with his unique combination of skills and experience. Martha often watched from their kitchen window as her husband worked, marveling at how completely he'd transformed from the haunted man who'd arrived with secrets heavier than his saddle bags. Martha's own transformation had been no less remarkable, though perhaps more subtle to outside observers. The woman who'd spent 5 years grieving on her porch had become the unofficial heart of Willow Creek, the person neighbors sought out when they needed advice, comfort, or simply someone to listen without judgment. Her sewing circle had evolved into something approaching a town council, as the women who gathered weekly in her parlor discussed everything from school funding to the need for a proper church bell. Martha had discovered that her years of solitude had given her insights into human nature that made her uniquely qualified to help others navigate their own struggles with loss, change, and the courage required to start over. The mayor had approached her repeatedly about running for official office, but Martha preferred the influence that came without titles or ceremonies. The porch where their story had truly begun remained Martha's favorite place in the world, though it no longer served as a waiting place but as a gathering spot for family and friends. Emma had carved her initials into one of the support posts on her 15th birthday, adding them to the initials Jake had carved there on their first wedding anniversary. The rocking chairs Jake had built for Martha's birthday were perfectly positioned to catch the evening breeze and provide the best view of Main Street, where life in Willow Creek unfolded with the comfortable predictability of a place where people knew they belonged. Visitors to the Thornton home invariably commented on the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from that porch, as if the love and contentment of the family who'd found each other there had somehow soaked into the wood itself. The revelation that would reshape their understanding of their own story came during Emma's 18th summer, when a letter arrived from the federal marshal's office containing information that stunned even Jake with its implications. The investigation that had begun with his testimony years earlier had continued to expand, ultimately uncovering a network of corruption that stretched across multiple territories and involved officials Jake had never suspected. More importantly for their family's peace of mind, the letter contained confirmation that every person connected to the conspiracy that had forced Jake to fake his death had been either convicted and imprisoned or killed while resisting arrest. The threat that had driven them to Willow Creek no longer existed, a fact that should have brought relief but instead forced all three to confront how completely their lives had changed from what they'd once imagined possible. Emma's decision about her future came as no surprise to parents who'd watched her grow into a young woman with clear priorities and unshakable values. The scholarship offers from Eastern universities were respectfully declined in favor of a different kind of education, one that would allow her to remain in Willow Creek while preparing for a career that combined her natural intelligence with her desire to help others. Doc Patterson, who'd been discussing retirement for several years, had agreed to train Emma as his replacement, an arrangement that would give the community a doctor who understood both modern medicine and the unique challenges of frontier life. Jake and Martha watched their daughter begin her medical studies with pride tempered by the knowledge that she was choosing a difficult path, but they also knew Emma possessed the strength and compassion necessary to succeed in any endeavor she chose. The wedding that took place in Willow Creek during Emma's 19th year wasn't hers, as some townspeople had expected, but rather the ceremony that united Sheriff Coleman with the schoolteacher who'd arrived from Denver the previous spring. The celebration brought together people from across the territory, many of whom had heard the story of the Thornton family and wanted to see for themselves the town where such unlikely happiness had taken root. Jake served as Sheriff Coleman's best man, a role that highlighted how completely he'd been accepted not just as Jeremiah Thornton but as a pillar of the community they all called home. Martha organized the reception with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage large gatherings, while Emma assisted Doc Patterson in treating the minor injuries that inevitably occurred when celebration and strong drink combined with enthusiastic dancing. The surprise that awaited the Thornton family that autumn came in the form of an unexpected visitor, a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell and claimed to be Jake's older sister. The reunion that followed revealed family connections Jake had thought were lost forever when he'd been forced to disappear, relationships that had been severed not by death but by the necessity of protecting people he loved from the dangers that had surrounded his life as a deputy marshal. Sarah brought news of nieces and nephews Jake had never met, parents who'd mourned a son they believed was dead, and a family history that Emma eagerly absorbed as she finally learned about the grandfather and grandmother she'd never known existed. The expansion of their family circle brought new joy but also the bittersweet recognition of time lost to circumstances beyond anyone's control. The decision to visit Jake's family in Colorado was made carefully, with full consideration of the risks and benefits such a journey might entail. Emma, now 20 and established as Doc Patterson's assistant, insisted she could manage his practice during their absence, supported by the other women in town who'd learned basic medical techniques over the years. The 3-week journey that followed was Emma's first time traveling beyond the boundaries of Arizona territory, an adventure that opened her eyes to landscapes and possibilities she'd only read about in books. For Jake, returning to places he'd known as Jeremiah Thornton required a different kind of courage than facing down corrupt officials, the bravery needed to reclaim relationships and memories he'd been forced to abandon. The homecoming that greeted them in Colorado exceeded even their most optimistic expectations, as Jake's parents wept over the son they believed was lost, and embraced the daughter-in-law and granddaughter they'd never dared hope to meet. Emma discovered that her grandfather shared her love of learning and her grandmother possessed the same gentle strength that had drawn Jake to Martha years earlier. The stories shared during long evenings around the fireplace filled in gaps in family history that Jake had never been able to provide, giving Emma a sense of belonging that extended beyond the borders of Willow Creek to encompass generations of people who'd faced challenges with dignity and faith in better times ahead. The return journey to Arizona brought them home with new understanding of how far they'd all traveled, not just in miles but in their capacity for happiness and their willingness to trust in the future. Willow Creek welcomed them back with the enthusiasm of a community that had discovered how much they valued the family who'd chosen to make their town home. Emma threw herself into her medical studies with renewed determination, inspired by stories of ancestors who'd overcome obstacles far greater than those she faced. Martha found herself corresponding regularly with Jake's family, relationships that enriched her life in ways she hadn't expected. Jake discovered that reclaiming his identity as Jeremiah Thornton didn't require abandoning the lessons he'd learned during his years as Jake Morrison, that both men were part of who he'd become. The legacy they built together in Willow Creek continued to grow and evolve as Emma completed her medical training and officially took over Doc Patterson's practice. Her reputation for skillful treatment and compassionate care drew patients from communities throughout the territory, people who traveled substantial distances to consult with the young doctor who understood that healing involved more than medicine. Jake's furniture had become sufficiently renowned that he'd begun shipping pieces to customers in California and Texas, his workshop serving as both business and training ground for young men who wanted to learn trades that would serve their communities. Martha's influence on the social and civic life of Willow Creek had become so substantial that the territorial governor had personally requested her input on legislation affecting frontier communities. The circle that had begun with Emma's simple observation about her father's smile had expanded to encompass not just their immediate family but an entire community that had been transformed by their presence. The porch where Martha had once waited alone now served as an informal town hall, where neighbors gathered to discuss everything from school board elections to the best way to preserve fruit for the winter months. The house that had echoed with loneliness now overflowed with the sounds of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and the constant stream of visitors who sought Martha's wisdom or Jake's counsel. Emma's presence had brought a new generation's energy and optimism to a town that had sometimes seemed caught between past and future. The evening ritual that had marked the beginning of their story continued to anchor their days, though it had evolved to accommodate the changes time had brought to their lives. Martha still sat on her porch each evening, but now she was joined by Jake and often by Emma when her medical duties allowed. They watched the sun set over the mountains that surrounded Willow Creek, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve the community that had embraced them. The conversations that took place on that porch ranged from practical matters like Emma's latest patient to philosophical discussions about the nature of home and belonging. The realization that struck Martha one evening, as she watched her husband and daughter discussing the finer points of setting a broken bone, was that she'd never truly been waiting for someone to return to her life. Instead, she'd been preparing herself for the moment when she'd be strong enough to open her heart to new love and new possibilities. Jake's arrival with Emma hadn't filled an empty space in her life so much as it had awakened capacities for joy and purpose she'd forgotten she possessed. The years of solitude hadn't been wasted time but rather a necessary preparation for the family she was meant to have, the life she was meant to live. The story that had begun with a child's innocent observation about her father's smile had become a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual lives but entire communities. Emma's insight that Jake only smiled when he could see Martha's porch had revealed a truth deeper than she could have understood at 8 years old. That happiness wasn't something that could be pursued directly but rather something that emerged when people found the courage to trust each other with their authentic selves. The waiting that had defined Martha's existence for 5 years hadn't been passive resignation but active preparation for the moment when she'd need to choose between safety and love. As the desert stars appeared in the darkening sky above Willow Creek, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds sat together on the porch where their story had begun, secure in the knowledge that some endings are actually beginnings and that the best chapters of life often start when you finally stop running and start believing in tomorrow. Emma had grown into a woman who understood that healing others required first understanding your own capacity for both strength and vulnerability. Jake had discovered that the man he'd been forced to become wasn't a betrayal of who he'd always been, but rather a revelation of depths he'd never known he possessed. Martha had learned that waiting for life to begin again was sometimes the first step toward a happiness more complete than anything she dared to imagine possible. The dusty streets of Willow Creek, Arizona still stretch endlessly under the desert sky, but now they lead somewhere for everyone who calls the town home. The porch where a lonely woman once waited for something she couldn't name has become a symbol of the transformative power of love, patience, and the courage to trust in possibilities that seem too good to be true. And somewhere in the evening air, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of a child's voice observing that her papa only smiled when he could see that special porch. The simple truth that changed 3 lives forever and proved that sometimes the most profound mysteries are solved by the innocent wisdom of those who see the world exactly as it is.